The train hissed like a wounded beast as it came to a stop in the dust-blown town of Dry Creek. Sarah Jane Harper stepped down with a carpetbag in one hand and her late husband's Bible in the other. The wind tugged at her bonnet ribbons and sent fine grit against her boots, but she didn't flinch. This was her second beginning. The first had ended in a graveyard in Missouri, beneath a maple tree where a man with kind eyes and a cough that never left had been laid to rest. The second began here, where the soil was dry, the sky too big, and hope, she prayed, still had root. She'd answered an advertisement posted by the town council, a schoolteacher wanted for a growing community. Room provided, stipend negotiable, opportunity for marriage implied but not stated. At 29, Sarah Jane had learned not to dream loudly, but deep in her heart a quiet vision bloomed. A small white schoolhouse, boys with slicked hair and girls in pigtails, the smell of chalk and apple pie, and maybe, if the Lord allowed, a man with strong hands and a voice that could steady her own. The boarding house loomed at the edge of town, worn clapboard siding and a porch that sagged like tired shoulders. Mrs. Edna Briggs greeted her with suspicion rather than warmth, taking one glance at her plain dress and thin frame before announcing, "You're the one from the East. Don't unpack too fast. Folks here are slow to take to new blood." Sarah Jane smiled despite it. "That's all right. I've grown used to slow beginnings." Inside, the room offered to her was small but clean. A single bed, a wash basin, and a window overlooking a cottonwood tree whose bark had peeled from too many winters. That night, she sat by the window with a candle and reread her letter from the council. No one had greeted her at the station. No one had come to inquire about lessons. But perhaps tomorrow they would. The following days passed like brittle leaves caught in wind. She introduced herself to the mayor, who offered a gruff nod. She posted notices on the general store wall, offering reading and writing lessons. Children stared at her but did not approach. Men glanced but did not linger. She baked a pie, peach and cinnamon, and offered it to the sheriff, who took it wordlessly. When he passed by her 2 days later, he didn't mention it. Still, she waited. In the quiet moments, she stitched her own dresses tighter, patched her shoes, and scrubbed her hands raw. The town was not cruel, but it wasn't kind either. It watched her with weary eyes. And then she met him. Thomas Avery was not the sort of man a woman could easily ignore. He stood tall on the steps of the blacksmith's barn, shirt sleeves rolled, smoke curling around him like a warning. His face was sun-darkened and unreadable, but when their eyes met, he didn't look away. He tipped his hat. She nodded. It wasn't more than a moment, but she felt the air shift. She asked Mrs. Briggs about him later. The older woman squinted through her spectacles and said, "Avery? Lost his wife years back. Keeps to himself. Doesn't take kindly to foolish women." Sarah Jane replied, "I'm not foolish," and let the matter drop. The next week, her wagon wheel cracked a mile outside town while returning from the creek. She stood staring at it, dust on her cheeks and sun burning through her bonnet, when a rider approached. It was Thomas. He dismounted, said nothing, and examined the wheel. She braced herself for indifference, but instead he fetched tools from his saddlebag and knelt beside her. He worked in silence. She offered him a handkerchief for the sweat on his brow. He didn't take it, but he didn't wave her away either. When the wheel was mended, she asked, "How much do I owe you?" He looked at her then, truly looked, as though measuring something deeper than coin. "Nothing." She opened her mouth to thank him, but he was already on his horse, tipping his hat once more before riding off. That night, she baked another pie, apple this time, with a lattice crust, and carried it to his homestead, a mile outside of town. His cabin was modest but sturdy, smoke rising from the chimney. She clutched the warm pie close, heart fluttering. There had been no invitation, but she told herself that kindness didn't need one. The front door was ajar, music drifting faintly from inside. She stepped onto the porch and knocked. No answer. The music grew louder, a fiddle, slightly off-key but joyful. She knocked again. A woman's laugh rang out from inside, high and flirtatious. "Oh, Tommy, you do play that thing like a snake charmer." Sarah Jane's stomach dropped. She backed away just as Thomas opened the door. He paused when he saw her. Shirt undone at the collar, fiddle still in hand. Behind him stood a red-haired woman in a silk bodice, leaning on his table, holding a half-drunk bottle of whiskey. "Oh," Sarah Jane said quietly, her face pale. "I'm sorry. I thought I brought you this." She held out the pie, her fingers trembling slightly. He looked down at it but didn't take it. "You shouldn't walk out this far alone," he said, his voice flat. "I won't again," she whispered, setting the pie on the porch rail. Then she turned and walked into the dusk, each step heavier than the last. The cold wind bit at her cheeks, and for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to cry. Not loudly. Just tears slipping silent and ashamed down her face. Back in her room, she undid her hair with stiff fingers and stared into the cracked mirror. Her reflection looked like a ghost, a woman who had dared to hope for too much. She whispered into the quiet, "You promised yourself you wouldn't fall." Outside, the wind howled like an old regret. The candle flickered once, then went out. But beneath the weight of humiliation, something steadier stirred. Not anger. Not even sorrow. A thin thread of resolve, quiet and deep, wound itself around her spine. She wouldn't leave. Not yet. Not when so much had yet to be proven. The town turned colder, though the season stayed the same. After the night she'd stood on Thomas Avery's porch with a trembling pie in her hands, Sarah Jane Harper became the talk of Dry Creek. They didn't speak her name outright, but the glances were sharp and the silence cut deeper than words. Women at the mercantile ceased their polite nods. The pastor's wife stopped asking about her Sunday readings. Children, once curious, were now kept close by mothers whispering warnings under their breath. "She's the one who walked to a man's house uninvited. She brought a pie like a harlot on the hunt. She should have stayed back east." Sarah Jane heard it all, through closed doors, in unfinished sentences, in the way folks refused to meet her eyes. But she held her head up. Pride was the only currency she had left. The small schoolhouse that had once lived in her dreams remained an empty lot on the outskirts of town. No funds, no interest. The town council muttered about expenses and timing. The children stayed uneducated, and she stayed unemployed. She had no family to write to, no friends to lean on. Her room at Mrs. Briggs' boarding house grew colder with each passing night, the walls tightening like ribs pulled in by grief. But she rose each morning, washed her face with well water, and stepped out into a town that had already made up its mind about her. With no money coming in, she turned to her hands. She stitched until her fingers bled, mending shirts for miners, patching aprons for mothers, hemming skirts that other women wouldn't admit she'd touched. Some wouldn't pay, claiming crooked seams or fraying thread, but she never argued. She took what coin she could and moved on. She baked bread with the last of her flour and traded it for a bundle of firewood. She offered lessons in reading, though no child came. She swept the chapel floor in silence, her knees sore, not out of piety but out of the need to stay moving, to keep despair from swallowing her whole. Sometimes she stood behind the church at dusk and watched the sun melt gold over the hills, her lips moving in prayer too quiet for even the Lord to hear. Not for rescue. She'd stopped praying for that. She prayed for the strength to outlast the shame. The town's cruelty never flared, it smoldered. Doors left half-closed in her face. Greetings left unsaid. Opportunities quietly passed to others. One morning, while hanging linens out back, she heard a child crying. The sound was distant at first, barely above the breeze, but it grew sharper, closer. She followed it into the trees behind the boarding house, and found a little girl no older than 6, barefoot and shivering, her dress torn and streaked with blood. The girl had coppery skin and jet-black hair matted with dust. Her wide, dark eyes locked onto Sarah Jane's, full of terror but too exhausted to flee. Sarah Jane dropped to her knees. "Sweetheart," she said softly, "you're safe now." The girl collapsed into her arms. She brought the child inside, wrapped her in a quilt, and washed her cuts with warm water and lye soap. The girl said nothing, not even a whimper, but clung to Sarah Jane with a desperation that pierced deep. She fed her a piece of bread, gave her clean water, and tucked her into bed beside the fire. All through the night, Sarah Jane sat beside her, watching the girl breathe. By morning, Dry Creek was in uproar. The child, they said, was Comanche. Wild. Dangerous. A spy. Sheriff Dalton came knocking before breakfast, a hand on his revolver, and 2 deputies behind him. She came from the hills, Sarah Jane said calmly. She's injured. She's a child. She's a threat, the sheriff replied. They send young ones to find weaknesses. You shelter her, you endanger us all. She didn't choose where she was born, Sarah Jane said. She's not your enemy. Not mine either. She's not your responsibility. Sarah Jane stepped between the sheriff and the girl sleeping in her bed. She is now. He stared at her long and hard. You keep her here, you better be ready for what that brings. That night the girl, who still hadn't spoken, sat by the fire chewing dried apples. She watched Sarah Jane mend a torn bonnet with careful stitches. When Sarah looked up, the girl reached out and touched her hand. "Peta," she said softly, placing a hand on her chest. Sarah Jane smiled for the first time in weeks. "Peta. I'm Sarah." The next day, a crude message was scratched into the boarding house door. "Red Lover." Underneath it, a drawing of a hanging rope. Mrs. Briggs stared at the sign, then at Sarah Jane. "You're bringing danger here." "I can't have that." "She's just a child," Sarah Jane said. "Then take her somewhere else. This house is for decent folk." Sarah Jane gathered her few possessions into a bundle, picked up Peta, and left without another word. No one offered her shelter. She walked to the edge of town and found an old sod shack left to ruin after last winter's storm. The roof had caved in halfway, but the fireplace still stood, and the walls held steady against the wind. She covered the hole with tarp and scrap tin, built a fire, and held Peta close through the night as coyotes howled beyond the hills. Days passed, and together they built something small but real. Peta gathered kindling and wild herbs. Sarah bartered mending for flour. They shared bread and silence, and slowly, Sarah's heart stitched itself around this child who had no one else. Then, one morning, the earth trembled with distant thunder, not from the sky, but from hooves. 80 riders appeared on the horizon, Comanche warriors, their paint bright as blood, feathers tied to their braids, weapons slung low and ready. At the front rode a tall, hard-eyed man with a silver amulet at his neck and a hawk painted on his chest. They stopped in a wide arc around the sod house, silent and unmoving. Sarah stepped outside, holding Peta's hand. The tall man dismounted and stared at the girl for a long time. Then his voice rang out in their language, guttural and sharp. Peta ran to him without hesitation, wrapping her arms around his waist. He knelt and embraced her, his hand cradling her head like she was something sacred. Sarah didn't move. He stood slowly and looked at her. One of the warriors raised a rifle, but the man barked a single word, and the weapon lowered. He walked forward until he stood just a breath away from Sarah. His face was carved from stone, but his eyes held something older, sorrow, maybe, or gratitude twisted with grief. "She live," he said in broken English, placing his hand on his chest. "Because you strong." Sarah Jane didn't know what to say. He reached into his coat and placed a bundle in her hands, dried meat, herbs, a carved pendant of bone. Then he stepped back, turned to his horse, and mounted. Peta lingered for only a moment, her eyes full of meaning words couldn't carry. Then she turned and rode with them. They vanished into the hills like smoke. Sarah stood alone once more. No town. No child. Just the sod house and a fire still warm. But her heart didn't feel empty. Not this time. Not anymore. Winter seeped in early that year, curling around the prairie with a quiet menace. Snow dusted the roofs of Dry Creek before the leaves had fully turned, and the wind whispered through the timbers like old ghosts. Sarah Jane patched a leak in the roof with stitched canvas and boiled stew made of dried beans and bone, stretching each meal like prayer across the week. She hadn't seen Peta or her people again, not even a glimpse on the ridgeline. But sometimes, in the hush between wind gusts, she swore she could hear the girls laugh, light as bells, threading through the cold. Life did not welcome her back. Townsfolk still crossed the street when they saw her coming. Mr. Pearson at the store still weighed her flour with suspicion. But they no longer carved words into her door. No one dared, not after 80 warriors had surrounded her house and then vanished without a single shot fired. That silence had changed something. Not softened hearts, no, but stilled the worst of the gossip. She continued her slow rebuild. One stitch at a time, one loaf at a time, offering dignity where the world had offered none in return. It was late November when the blacksmith's apprentice knocked on her makeshift door. She'd seen him before, tall, broad-shouldered, with arms like split logs and eyes a soft shade of winter sky. Isaac Barrett. He never said much in town, just did his work and moved through life with a quiet that didn't demand attention. He stood on her step, holding a wool coat with one sleeve nearly torn from the seam. "Miss Harper," he said, tugging at his hat, "I heard you do mending." She nodded. "If the thread's strong enough." His smile was faint but kind. "I'd be obliged." She gestured for him to come in. He ducked through the low doorway, filling the room with his frame and a faint scent of iron and wood smoke. She worked by the fire, threading her needle, and he sat across from her without speaking, his hands resting easy on his knees. The coat was well worn, the fabric softened by years of use. She mended it carefully, reinforcing the seam with precise, patient stitches. "Thank you," he said as she handed it back. "Didn't charge," she replied. He hesitated, then left 3 coins on the table. "Worth more than most church sermons." And then he left. He came back the next week, this time with a flannel shirt and a basket of apples. She mended while he chopped firewood in the yard without being asked. After that, he came every Sunday afternoon, never staying long, never asking questions. Sometimes he brought things that didn't need fixing, buttons just barely loose, hems with no real tear. Sometimes he brought books, laying them beside her fire without a word. When she thanked him, he just nodded. They didn't speak much, but something bloomed in the quiet. One afternoon, she offered him stew. He sat beside her at the table made from 2 barrels and a plank. She watched him eat in comfortable silence, the steam from their bowls mingling in the space between them. "I was there that day," he said softly. She looked up. "When they came. The Comanche. I saw you step between a child and a sheriff with nothing but your body." He paused. "That kind of courage don't come from sermons." She said nothing. Her hands rested still against the table. He smiled faintly. "I reckon people judged you before they ever saw you. I reckon they still do." He nodded. "But I don't." She didn't know what to say to that. But her chest felt warm in a way that had nothing to do with the fire. Through the weeks that followed, he built her a proper bench for the fireplace. He repaired the hinge on her door. He said little, always careful, always respectful. She began to wait for him without admitting it to herself. They read together. She would trace passages with her finger, and he'd follow the rhythm of her voice, nodding occasionally, sometimes smiling at a line she hadn't noticed was funny. He never corrected her. He never tried to impress her. And that, perhaps, was what made her heart begin to lean in his direction. Once, she baked a pie, apple, with the spices she'd traded for at great cost, and left it cooling on the windowsill. He didn't say anything when he saw it, but he cut a slice carefully, reverently, and took exactly 2 bites. He looked at her, eyes full of something unspoken. Then he finished it slowly, as though savoring every memory he'd never had before that moment. And when he was done, he simply said, "Best thing I ever tasted." Another Sunday, she caught her sleeve on a nail. The fabric tore clean through. She winced, half in pain, half in frustration. Isaac crossed the room and knelt in front of her without asking. He gently lifted her arm, studied the rip, and said, "Give me a day. I'll fix it right." She blinked. "You so? I learn things from those I respect." She felt the air still around them. He didn't touch her. Didn't try to. But in the way his hands hovered near hers, in the way his gaze didn't flinch or falter, she felt something safer than walls. Something steadier than promises. That evening, as he stood to leave, he turned back at the door. "You ever need someone to walk with you into town," he said, "I'd be proud to be seen beside you." She watched him go, heart thrumming like spring beneath frost. She didn't cry. But the tears sat behind her eyes, warm and quiet. That night, she read the same page 3 times and couldn't remember a word. She ran her fingers over the mended sleeve of her dress, now whole again, and wondered what it meant, to be seen not for charity, but for the strength born of surviving. The next Sunday, Isaac arrived with a small wooden box. "I made it for you," he said. "Keeps needles sharp. Holds thread. Got a carved groove here for scissors." She opened it and traced the smooth cedar grain with a trembling hand. "I never," she began, but couldn't finish. "You don't have to say anything," he said gently. But she did. "Thank you, Isaac." He smiled, eyes full of quiet thunder. In the weeks that followed, people in town began to glance their way when they walked the dusty road side by side. The whispers returned, but this time they lacked venom. Curiosity had replaced contempt. One day, at the general store, Mrs. Pearson said, "That young man of yours, he's solid stock." Sarah Jane didn't reply. But her cheeks warmed and her heart whispered yes. On the edge of December, with snow falling soft as breath, Isaac lingered after supper. He stood in her doorway, the sky pale behind him, and looked at her like a man who'd found the last light in a dark world. "I'm not much with words," he said slowly, "but I reckon I've come to care about you in a way that don't need fixing or rushing." She stepped toward him. Her voice was steady. "I reckon I care the same." He didn't reach for her. He simply nodded, as if the truth was enough for now. And it was. She watched him walk into the snow, the wind catching his coat, the moon catching the edge of his path. And she thought, not for the first time, that some hearts grow stronger in silence. The fire inside crackled low. She stirred it, then sat near the warmth, holding the cedar box close. Her fingers trembled. Not with fear. With hope. Because for the first time in a long while, she wasn't waiting to be rescued. She was being chosen. Steadily. Gently. As she was. The morning of the town harvest gathering dawned crisp and gold-lit, every breath catching in the air like frost-sketched lace. Dry Creek bustled with quiet energy. Children chased chickens through the alleys, and the smell of spiced bread and roasted meat curled over rooftops like a song. Someone played a fiddle near the mercantile. Someone else hammered up bunting made of old fabric strips dyed in shades of autumn. This was the first celebration the town had dared in 2 years, and folks seemed determined to make it count. Sarah Jane Harper had no intention of going. She stared at herself in the small mirror above the washbasin, clutching the shawl Mrs. Macready had traded her for 2 jars of wild plum jam. Her hands trembled slightly, not from the cold. She hadn't stood in front of a crowd since the day she'd been left in the dust by the preacher's son, her dress hem soaked in mud and her heart stripped bare by shame. The town hadn't truly welcomed her back, not with warmth, not with open arms. But they no longer crossed the street to avoid her. And in the bakery last week, young Ruthie Jenkins had asked for help tying her bonnet ribbon. A small thing, but it had mattered. She wrapped the shawl tighter, gathered her courage, and stepped into the fading afternoon sun. The churchyard had been cleared for dancing, long tables lined with bread, stew pots, and thick slices of smoked ham. Lanterns swung from tree limbs like little stars waiting for dusk. Isaac stood near the water pump, sleeves rolled, cheeks pink from effort, helping the town boys carry firewood for the bonfire. He saw her before she reached the edge of the yard. His smile wasn't wide, wasn't boastful, but it held something steady, like a promise whispered only once but meant forever. "You came," he said. "I did," she replied. He looked at her like she was the moon risen early, something unexpected and breathtaking. People watched. She felt it. Murmurs tugged at the corners of the crowd. But none of it mattered, not when he offered his arm without hesitation, and not when she took it with quiet resolve. They walked once around the yard, greeting those who made eye contact. A few did. Mrs. Pearson nodded. Mr. Ames tipped his hat. Children whispered, then giggled and ran past, their joy too big to be stopped by memory or rumor. As the first strains of a reel began, Isaac turned to her. "May I have the honor?" She hesitated, heart thudding like hooves over dry earth. Then she nodded. He didn't lead like a man showing off. He moved like someone steadying a partner over uncertain ground. They danced slowly, rhythm rising around them, her shawl catching the wind, his hand resting lightly above her waist. It wasn't perfection. It was something far better, it was real. When the song ended, a hush fell. Not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet shift in the air, as if the whole town had inhaled at once. And then someone clapped. Then another. Then the music resumed. But the clapping wasn't for the song. It was for them. She turned to look. Not everyone smiled. Not everyone offered warmth. But the ones who did, the widow from the boarding house, the young boy she'd once bandaged after he fell from a horse, even the blacksmith with soot still on his face, they looked at her not with suspicion, but with recognition. That evening, Isaac walked her home beneath a sky blooming with stars. The lantern he carried lit the path in flickering amber. Neither spoke until they reached her door. "I reckon the town sees you now," he said softly. "I reckon I don't need them to. Not any more." He nodded, then stepped a little closer. "I never asked for much," he murmured. "And I'm not asking now. But I would be mighty proud if you let me stay." She looked into his eyes, saw no demand, no rescue, no need to be saved or praised. Just a man offering steadiness in a world that had been anything but. "You've already stayed," she whispered. And for the first time she kissed him. Not like in books. Not like thunder or fire. But like the settling of wind after a long storm. Like the final stitch in a long seam. Like coming home. Weeks passed. Snow fell. And one day, the schoolmistress invited Sarah Jane to read aloud to the children. Another day, the mayor's wife asked if she'd consider helping organize the winter charity drive. It was slow. But it was change. One morning, Isaac built a shelf above the fireplace. He placed on it the cedar sewing box, a sprig of dried wildflower from their first walk, and a small carving of a dove he whittled in silence during long nights. Above that shelf, he hung a single word carved into a plank of salvaged barnwood: dignity. And in that home, with wind curling at the window and stew simmering on the stove, they built a life not of grand things, but of steady ones. The town remembered what she had done, what she had risked for a child not her own, what she had endured. And over time, they stopped calling her the woman who was left. They started calling her Sarah Jane Harper. And when the Comanche passed through the edge of Dry Creek again in the spring, they nodded toward her house with something almost like respect. Because sometimes, a single act of courage is enough to ripple through generations. And sometimes, love doesn't come in thunder or roses, but in the offer of a warm hand on a cold morning. So if you've ever been cast aside, ever been left standing with your heart in your hands while the world watched and whispered, if you've ever built a life from threads and crumbs and the steadiness of your own spirit, remember Sarah Jane Harper. She was not saved. She was not spared. She endured. And in doing so, she became seen. So when they call you too much or not enough, when they whisper, let them. You are not theirs to define. You are your own quiet miracle.